the Civil Society 20 Summit. I'll start just by quickly introducing myself. My name is Noura Salim, and I'm part of the International Advisory Committee of the C20, representing both Sawiris Foundation for Social Development, a grant-making foundation based in Egypt, as well as the Arab Foundations Forum, where I have the privilege of being the chair of the board. I'm truly honored today to be moderating this panel with 6 great experts from a variety of fields, representing both multilaterals as well as NGOs, as well as academia. And I think we will have a very profound session on an important topic. So the title of our session is Prioritizing Human Security, Reevaluating National Security in a Time of Crisis. So it's quite a hefty title. But basically, as we step back, I think that, and as I think about it from my view as someone that works in civil society, I think it has been an incredibly challenging year for everyone with COVID. What it has meant for us as development actors is actually a need to prioritize putting people, putting social equality, supporting in terms of unemployment, supporting in terms of social safety nets, healthcare, education, which has looked very different. And we see that now, as we enter what appears to be an economic crisis globally, that there is a need for not just development actors, but governments to continue prioritizing human security, to continue prioritizing social equality, and to really focus on, as I said, education, healthcare, climate change, environment, employment. And our hope is that all those issues do not become sort of pushed back into the agenda as other things perhaps take priority. And so without further ado, before I quickly introduce the panelists and pose our opening question, I'd like to introduce Ms. Kani Wikanaraja, the Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, who will be joining us via a video statement.
Distinguished panel members, moderator, ladies and gentlemen. There are many tipping points that can destabilize a country's sense of security, like political instability, violent extremism, extreme climatic events, or, as we're facing now, a global pandemic of massive proportions. So I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you today on prioritizing human security and looking at this as a reevaluation of what we've called national security in the times that we're in. Now, until this moment, global human development, and with it, an overall sense of human security, was doing well. Extreme poverty was coming down, and income and education levels were advancing. And yet, after 3 decades of positive trends, we now see a reversal in human development, with COVID-19 being the primary culprit and not the only one. Some might say that the previous development gains did not reach everyone, and that many were left out of these pathways to progress, and in fact, left some more vulnerable than before. And they would be right. We see that, for instance, with COVID, inequality, gender-based violence, and human rights abuses have in fact risen. This faceless, borderless virus has already reversed our course on the global goals and is having far-reaching impacts on all people in all countries. So what does it mean to be nationally secure in times like this, when over 100 million people are pushed back into extreme poverty? When economies have been brought to their knees with the closure of borders and disruption to global trade and travel. Now, science is trying to catch up, and we know it will, to provide us with a vaccine for COVID-19, and we hope answers also to combat climate change and to do it rapidly. Fiscal stimulus packages are also trying to play catch up, to funnel resources to keep markets, jobs, businesses, consumer spending afloat. We are looking to leaders to bring about mediated ceasefires and social movements to keep these leaders and public and private institutions not just in check, but also directed to do the right thing when it comes to these large existential threats. These larger-than-life challenges are not national. They threaten national security, but they cannot be responded to by national armies, national policies, and national resources alone. These are vast global crises that must be met with global and multilateral instruments that support and complement national ones. Human security puts people's well-being at the center of solving problems, and it recognizes people as the problem solvers. Through history, it has been people's ingenuity, social organization, political will, and sheer determination to bring about the changes needed that has made things happen. So even when confronted with these existential threats, this is when we need more than ever to come together, to grow back what is needed to put policies and investments where they're needed most, and to inspire people to work together on the solutions. Human security recognizes that no one nation, community, nor household can go it alone. It is the strength of shared purpose and putting that collective shoulder to the wheel, working together as governments, private sector, and civil society, that will move things forward at the speed and scale that we need it to. So to be very specific, I have called for 3 wins that prioritizes human security. First, a people's vaccine that is accessible to all as soon as possible and is covered by universal healthcare, because none of us is safe until everyone is safe. Second, providing affordable and unhindered access to the internet as a public good so that everyone can benefit from the digital revolution with access to information, jobs, and learning. And third, a switch out of fossil fuels to renewable energy to ensure a cleaner, safer climate that protects our health and our planet. UNDP is committed to helping countries along these tracks to look forward towards 2030 and to keep sight of the global goals. The choices we make today on such issues will cement countries in their peace and development pathways for decades to come. And every one of us has a role to make sure that these pathways are the right ones. So at the C20, the question I leave you with is as follows. Do we hunker down, stay defensive, and return to old habits of growth with pollution, inequality, and insecurity? Or do we choose at this moment to center our policies and investments on human well-being and human security that keeps our families, nations, and the world cleaner, safer, and more prosperous for all? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think a powerful word from Ms. Kani, and I think I would like to just summarize a few points before I open up to the panel. Basically, I think the point around human security, with people really being at the center in terms of policies that look at people, that consider them as problem solvers themselves, with a focus on a shared purpose. And I think she left us with 3 very key takeaways or key recommendations around a vaccine, around affordable and unhindered access to internet, which is not just for jobs, but also as we think about education and the millions of children and their need to access education, and around renewable energy, and obviously as it relates to climate change. So with that, I would like to segue into my first question to the panel, which is related to human security. I think when we think of human security, it's quite sort of, it's a big word. It encompasses many things. And I would like each panelist to perhaps from their experience, from their work, from their knowledge, to address how they define human security and the most important elements that they see as they think about human security. And with that, I'd like to start with Ms. Valerie Schmidt, Deputy Director, Social Protection Department at the ILO. Valerie, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. So my name is Valerie Schmidt and I work in the area of social protection. And actually, when I looked a little bit what is the definition of human security, the basic definition, it's really human security to free people from want and from fear. And actually, when I'm looking at what I'm doing and what the social protection department is doing around social protection actually contributes to make security a reality for all, in particular with regard to realizing the human right to social security. Indeed, social protection is a set of measures that provide people with at least access to essential health care for all. And what Kani said about the vaccines that should be there for all, the massive vaccination cannot be done with essential health care, access to healthcare services. So one core component of social protection. The second provision that social protection makes is security across the life cycle. For children, income security can take the form of child allowances, scholarships, for instance. For the working age population, this may include benefits in cases of maternity, unemployment, work injury, or disability. And for older persons, it can take the form of old age pensions. We at the ILO, but ILO represents 187 countries, we are building on a strong international commitment in human rights and international social security standards. One of the main standards on social protection is the Social Protection Force recommendation that was adopted by all member states of the ILO in 2012. However, despite this standard, which is at the basis of our work, more efforts are needed today to make social protection a reality for all. By adopting this recommendation, countries have reaffirmed the human right to social security and agreed that social protection should provide universal protection for all throughout the life course. So a social protection system that provides universal health coverage and an older citizens grant, for instance, which is the case in many developing countries. It is a good start, a very good start, but it leaves behind several categories of the population that may also face specific needs, such as the working age population, families with children, persons with disabilities, etc. So social protection should therefore be responsive to people's needs, comprehensive, and also adequate. For instance, a pension of $2 per month, which is the case in some countries, is not adequate as it doesn't allow older people to live in dignity. So the experience of many countries demonstrates the enormous value of well-designed social protection systems that ensure universal access to healthcare throughout the life course, that provide child and family benefits for all children, that provide income security for the working age, and income security also in old age. And if the COVID-19 pandemic has sent the world one message, it is that we are only as safe as the most vulnerable among us. Or as Kani said, none of us is safe until everyone is safe. So this has served as a real wake-up call, alerting the global community to the crucial importance of social protection. In today's world, social protection is a reality for only a minority. Even before COVID-19 threw the world into turmoil, 55% of the world's population, this means 4 billion people, had no access to social protection at all. And in some regions, this exclusion is much higher, like in Africa, where 82% of the population has no social protection at all. So this is why social protection became one of the policy priority responses to the crisis in all countries. We have a social protection monitor at the ILO, and we have tracked what was happening at country level. And within a few months, 1,500 social protection emergency measures were established in 208 countries.
Thank you,
However,
Valerie.
yes.
Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, I will
No,
stop.
thank you. I'll just try to keep track of the time. But thank you so much. And I think important sort of definition from your part, really with a focus on social protection as it relates to universal healthcare access, pensions, income security. So thank you very much for that perspective. And I'd like to move to Ms. Elena Bonometti, the Chief Executive Officer of Tostan. Elena, please. And 2 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you and welcome everyone. And allow me to say how excited I am to be part of this distinguished panel. And I also want to send a message to our audience. We can't see you, we can't hear you, but we know you are there. And we really want to thank you for your time today. So I'm the CEO of Tostan. My name is Elena Bonometti, and Tostan is an organization that has partnered for the past 30 years in West Africa with communities at the grassroots to help to empower them to develop and fulfill their vision of well-being, and actually has inspired large-scale movement leading to dignity for all that have really human rights at the center. So I'm particularly excited to be part of this panel today because it means that human security is a holistic concept today. And so what Tostan has done over the past 30 years is really allow people to lead their way. And our conceptual framework is around well-being. So really what communities want for themselves and their children, of course, aligns absolutely with the concept of human security, but we call it a Tostan well-being. So our well-being framework is a multidimensional one, and there are 3 particular dimensions which are critical. The one which is the individual one, and of course, to this one, we have really values attached to this individual dimension, and then the social network of reference. And we have been famous globally for the abandonment of female genital cutting and child marriage, which are gender-related social norms. And we know that individuals are able to reinforce their values and their beliefs and decide also to abandon practices which are not aligned to those values to really bring about well-being for their communities. And then of course there is a 3rd dimension, which is really the environment one, the material one. And these 3 dimensions should move along together. Now at Tostan, the experience taught us that how human security is improved is actually equally important, if not more important, than how we define it. So people have to express their views and participate in finding and implementing solutions to the challenges that they face. So really, in a nutshell, if I can leave with a message, I would say that empowering people to lead their way is indeed really a crucial aspect of human security. Thank you. Over to you, Nora.
Thank you very much, Elena. And I'll move to Mr. Adam Bouloukos, resident representative in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the UNDP. Adam, please go ahead. Very good.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks to the organizers of the C20 for allowing UNDP to be present in this panel. And as Nora said, I'm the only panelist, I think, who's in Saudi Arabia at the moment. I'm very proud and happy to be here. It's a time of great change in the kingdom. And so much is happening with all the engagement groups and the G20 itself. It's quite dynamic. I'll say that in the kingdom, the role of CSO is really in a nascent stage, but it's growing, and it's an exciting time to be here to see if UNDP can help facilitate some of that growth. On the definition of human security, and this is a bit verbose, it's UN language, but I'll read it just because I think it may be useful to kind of contextualize things. This concept of human security, in fact, originated in a UNDP document in 1994, so it's not a new idea. That report was New Dimensions of Human Security, and the approach broadens the scope of security analysis and policy from territorial security to security of people, which we've already heard about, that this is a people-centered approach to security. It's comprehensive. It's also context-specific. So as we just learned from Elena, looking at communities and their needs and where security issues are identified. It tries to address a range of risks and threats that endanger and undermine the resilience of communities and societies. It recognizes the interlinkages between peace, development, human rights, and equally considers civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The report also identified key dimensions of human security: economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political. So as I said, this is a kind of a dense definition, but it does show that we need to think very broadly about human security. We need to also be very much engaged with our communities to find out how it is that they're defining their security challenges and how those security challenges morph over time. I mean, this is, I think, maybe one of the most critical things. So communities that had never dealt with, health concerns like COVID are now suddenly kind of in areas of insecurity and dealing with stresses, psychosocial concerns that maybe had never emerged in those communities before. So, how we look at our communication linkages to different populations, how the CSO community can be that link and to identify concerns that would otherwise be masked in the bigger discussion on security, I think is one of the critical pieces to take from this type of dense definition. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for highlighting. Obviously, it is a complex topic and it's a complex issue, and I appreciate the time you took to state the definition, which shows both how multidimensional it is, how comprehensive it is, and I think how complicated it is as well. I'd like to move to Mr. Wolfgang Leumer, Senior Program Director of the Civil Society Education Fund and Global Campaign for Education, please.
Okay, thank you so much. It's quite an honor to be on this panel. I work with the Global Campaign for Education. Our emphasis in responding to the health and economic crisis caused by COVID is to make sure that the crisis caused by lockdown will not be used as a pretext to justify cuts on the education budget, as this will have an aggravating knock-on effect on an already existing education crisis. So the relevance of and commitment to schooling, teaching and learning must be upheld. A budget must not be curtailed. So this will not be an easy ask, but if we want to attain SDG 4, the commitments made may not be softened. Reflecting on the term security, it made me think that the term has more a connotation for me as I did not go into any definitions, but I have rather the connotation of security has to do with guarding against threats on one's physical immunity. There's a connex of security with policing and military and security council and securocrats, which is possibly not exactly what we want to say when we express our fears and anxieties vis-a-vis the virus. The term safety is, in my opinion, possibly more appropriate. People want to be safe from viruses and safe from all possible emergencies, including natural disaster, conflicts and health threats, safe also from hunger, and safe from losing their jobs and income. I found it interesting to look at other sort of schools of thought, and I went to the donut economy school. I don't know whether you've heard about that. And they have a nice concept of which postulates that inclusive and sustainable economic development can make a safe and just space for humanity a possibility. Now back to global campaign. Civil society engages governments, the duty bearers, based on a human rights global universal framework, which is the bulwark needed to face neoliberal trends and especially ensuring that the right to education in emergency situations can be realized and guaranteed. Human rights law should be enforced in all contexts, so safety is a consequence of human rights realization. I think that is why we are sort of doing all our campaign work and our advocacy to make sure that education is built into a human rights framework, and therefore also education financing, we'll come back to that theme, cannot falter. It should grow to strengthen our immune system for the next crisis.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Thank you, and I think I look forward to returning to the part about education later in our panel. And with that, I'd like to go to Ms. Cordo Williams, Head of the Women's Rights at Action Aid International. Cordo, please.
Yeah, thank you, Nora, and again, it is an honor to be a part of this important discussion. I'll start by saying that ActionAid in the last decade has definitely developed our strategies and our ways of working from the perspective of human security. And as Adam mentioned, it's not a new terminology within the organization, that we've always tried to make a shift from that original and traditional understanding of security to basically make visible that the world was in crisis as we did our work. So multiple and intersecting crises related to health, to the economy, to climate. Within the context of COVID, the COVID pandemic, we all know that COVID does not discriminate, but its impacts do. So with COVID, we've seen the pandemic, we've seen that there is a deepening, revelation of pre-existing inequalities and the exposure of vulnerabilities within different systems, social, political, and economic systems. One example, that we're thinking about, I was thinking about as I, put this together, is that a person who is at, a high level of privilege and access to different services, COVID is going to affect them. Their experience is going to be quite different from someone who, say, for example, is working as a cleaner, or a woman who is in a village. Is going to be a completely different experience. So at the moment, the way that I would define, contribute to this definition and reevaluation of COVID, of human security, is that human security should mean a green, just, and feminist response and recovery from the pandemic. It is important to do that because human security depends on our ability to build back better from the crisis and face the existential threats of the climate crisis. Unless we can do that, we may be, going back, like the first speaker mentioned, we may be going back to the same blueprint, the same approaches, and we may not solve any problems, in terms of our thinking.
Thank you very much, Porto. And last but not least, Professor Guy Standing, founder and co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network and professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I had the privilege of directing the first major global program on human security, and I was also privileged to work with the UNDP on the human security indexes and so on. And I came to realize that basically we want basic security for all. And that must mean, I think, two meta securities above all others. First is that everybody should have basic income security. We need that as a definite principle for all social policies. But additionally, we need voice. You can't have security unless everybody has voice in society, both at the individual level and at the collective level. Otherwise, we all remain vulnerable. And I think the opportunities that I've had to operationalize basic income pilots in developing countries has given me the access to knowledge that if you provide those two things, people start looking after their basic needs better than if it's left to bureaucrats and left to outsiders. They improve their health, they improve the schooling of their children, they improve the status of women, and many other things that come with that, people with disabilities and so on. And in operationalizing the program in the ILO on socioeconomic security, I came to appreciate that we need to evaluate every single policy proposal by a number of principles. The first principle I call the security difference principle, after John Rawls's philosophy, which is no policy is socially just unless it improves the security of the most insecure groups in society. And a remarkable number of policies abuse that principle. The second principle is what I call the paternalism test principle. No policy is socially just if it imposes controls on some groups that are not imposed on the most free groups in society. And the third principle I call the rights, not charity principle. A policy is only just if it improves the rights of the recipients of that policy and reduces the discretionary power of the bureaucrats or the providers of that policy. And the next principle, which we haven't mentioned so far, but I think it's implicit in everything we've been saying, I call the ecological constraint principle, which is that we must have policies that take account that they must do no harm to the ecology and must respect what's called the precautionary principle. If there's a risk of doing harm, then they should not be going ahead with that particular policy. And finally, I believe in a dignified work principle, in that a set of policies and mechanisms should encourage people to be able to develop themselves through the way they work and the way they develop themselves. And the final point I want to make is this. The post-1945 era was marked by an advance in social security that took the world as existing with contingency risks. There were insecurities that could be dealt with social insurance of some sort. But today, in a globalized world based on what I call rentier capitalism, insecurity is characterized by uncertainty. Millions of people, particularly in the group that I write a lot about, the precariat, face a life of chronic uncertainty. You can't insure against uncertainty. It's the famous Donald Rumsfeld image of unknown unknowns. Millions and millions of people every single day are faced with uncertainties. And this is something that is specific to our age and a much greater threat because it leads to things I will talk about later. But for me, characterizing human security today is a very different challenge to what it would have been 50 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Guy. And I think lots of food for thought from all of the panelists. And what I take away is I think that the concentration around the voice, which Professor Guy also ended with, and that I think was stated by most of the panelists, and it's really about participatory, as Adina had spoken about, as Cordo said, as Adam said, it's about the people themselves being at the center of that, and it's not what we're doing to them, but it's their voices as part of that human-centered approach. But then I think we have two different thoughts, and I'd like to highlight them because I think they can be addressed in the next set of questions. So going from the very comprehensive definition that was employed by Adam, similarly by Corto, that says that human security is really, multidimensional. It is quite convoluted. It encompasses everything from, income security to healthcare access, to pensions, to economic, to environment, to peace, to the very basic definition that I think Professor Guy ended with, which was making the argument that, it's basic income, and then basically you empower them and they themselves as humans can take care of the rest. And I think it's a very interesting, extremes of the spectrum of looking at human security, sort of the role of what the state should provide, the comprehensive set of services versus guaranteeing one thing and leaving it to you then to be empowered enough to consider the rest. And on a final note, before I start with the next set of questions, I think there was also a very interesting notion around the varying definition of human security according to the time that we're looking at. So also brought about by Corto that now COVID leaves us at a very different time. And with that, how we think about human security coming out of that perhaps will look slightly different than it did in the past. Now, COVID, as many of the panelists also said, we have made progress prior to COVID. However, there was still a lot of work that needed to be done. And we worry as civil society about COVID being used as a pretext, as also Mr. Wolfgang had stated, to basically park a lot of those issues on the side. And so I'll start with Ms. Valerie, and the question really is, as we think about human security in the various ways as it was defined, and as we are all concerned about the impacts of Corona and about what it could mean for global policy, social protection, as you highlighted, remains very critical. And I'm curious to understand how you effectively then protect the most marginalized, particularly at the time that we are in today. And if you can also reflect on how you see social protection vis-a-vis, basic income security.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, as I explained in the introduction, the response to COVID was massive in all countries, and most of them included, all of them actually, 208 countries included either new social protection measures or adapted existing social protection schemes to really cover a larger group of the population that were before COVID-19 left behind. Just to give you one example of Togo, that launched a new program, Novici, which means mutual help, to support informal economy workers that were the most affected by lockdown measures. So this group, the informal economy workers, is the group that is, we call it the missing middle, because they are usually not covered by social assistance programs, and they are not covered either by social insurance programs that have so far in many countries not been able to adapt themselves to really provide the benefit packages and the payment schedule that are adapted to this group of the population. Another example is Mozambique, where here the national cash transfer program was adapted to provide higher levels of benefits to its normal beneficiaries, which are the poor and vulnerable. But in addition to that, it managed to extend coverage to 1 million additional beneficiaries, again, people in the informal economy, as a temporary COVID-19 emergency assistance. So if there is a silver lining to this crisis, it is really the recognition of the necessity and value of social protection, both to respond to the crisis and to build back better. However, these social protection measures introduced as an emergency response to COVID-19 are only temporary, and stopgap measures will not be enough to protect people during this crisis and of course beyond. So we believe that countries should really use the political momentum of COVID-19 and the recognition of the importance of social protection to build on these temporary measures and to transform them into sustainable social protection systems. Just to give you again an example, all these databases that have been created during COVID-19 to provide emergency assistance to workers in the informal economy, they could now be used by social insurance mechanisms, the Caisse Nationale de Sécurité Sociale, etc., to reach out to these people with adapted social protection benefit packages. So if we fail this momentum, we will go back to a situation most probably worse than before COVID-19, whereas there is clearly an opportunity to do much better than before. However, the challenges of coverage are huge. As I explained in my introduction, today 55% of the world's population has no access to social protection at all. So most of these people are in the informal economy. They are living from hand to mouth and are indeed extremely vulnerable. But this huge coverage gap is actually linked to an underinvestment in social protection. There's a huge financing gap that existed prior to the COVID-19 and that has increased during COVID-19 because of the huge demand for social protection and of course the drop in GDP. So we are at the ILO calculating what is the financing gap for social protection. And the latest data shows that if we want to achieve the SDGs on social protection, that are SDG 1.3 and 3.8 by 2020, so by the end of this year, we would need to invest immediately an additional 1.2 trillion US dollar in social protection in developing countries. So you see the financing gap is enormous. However, of course, the idea is not to achieve the SDGs on social protection immediately, it's to achieve within 10 years by 2030. So if we really want to be serious about achieving the SDGs on social protection by 2030, developing countries should on average invest an additional 2.2% of their GDP to what they are investing today in social protection. So our first recommendation is really that we need to invest more in social protection. In principle, this additional investment should come from national resources, and there are many ways to create more resources for social protection through, for instance, reallocation of public spending, creation of new income taxes, fighting illicit financial flows, etc. But a promising path to the extension of social protection is really focusing on the missing middle, the informal economy workers, that there is a potential. These people have the potential to contribute a little bit to social protection. And so by ensuring that they can participate, because they are excluded from social assistance. So ensuring that they can participate in contributory social protection that are adapted to their needs, to their capacities of payment, etc., will not only reduce the the burden on the government for social assistance, but increase the contribution and tax base in the country, and will also contribute to the formalization of the economy. However, for low-income countries, where social protection financing gaps are high compared to their fiscal capacity, domestic resource mobilization will not be enough. And this is where international solidarity needs to come in. And as Kenny said, this issue of the COVID-19, this issue of the lack of social protection is a global issue. And the solution, of course, has to come from each and individual countries, but there is also a need for international solidarity. And this is why today, and even the Global Coalition for Social Protection Forces is extremely involved in today's discussion on the creation of a global fund for social protection. So investing more in social protection is necessary, but it will not be sufficient. It is equally important to invest better in social protection. And for the ILO, and many of us actually in this conference, investing better needs that we need to respect the principle of solidarity in financing between different groups, between the high and low income earners, between those who have good health and those with preconditions, or between those in the labor force and those who cannot work. This will allow to cover many more groups, solidarity in financing, that may not be able to contribute sufficiently to finance their own protection. Investing better also means that policy options are not decided behind closed doors, but that they are discussed through national dialogues with governments, but in governments you have also ministries of finance, not only labor and social welfare. We need to be able to discuss with ministries of finance. With employers' organizations and workers' organizations, civil society organizations, and these dialogues will really result in a shared vision and coordinated action to really move in the area of extension of social protection. As Kenny said in her introduction, people should be at the center of the solution, and many of the panelists reinforce this idea of voice. There is a voice. We need to ensure that this voice can be expressed on what is needed, how it is needed, and to move forward. So this national dialogue, why it's important that we also talk to the ministries of finance is because these additional investments not only need to be desirable, but also feasible, of course. But I'm not naive, and we know from experience that solidarity in financing and social dialogue are not yet a reality in most countries, and they are not systematically promoted by all development partners. So we certainly need to find a common pathway to this common objective. So as I said, 2 weeks ago, the government of France and the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights organized a high-level meeting on a global fund for social protection. The idea is not to create a new vertical fund at all. This is not at all the idea. The idea is more to agree on an initiative that would rely on two pillars. One pillar is a common roadmap to guide us in achieving more and better investments in social protection. And the second pillar is to increase coordination between institutions at national level, so the different ministries involved, social partners, civil society, etc., as well as development partners and IFIs that should coordinate their action both technically and financially. So coordination of ideas and of actors needs to take place in the countries and in the global area. After a decade of promoting national social protection floors since 2009 with the UN Social Protection Floor Initiative, and since 2012 with the adoption of the recommendation 202 on social protection floors, now comes a new decade on financing more and financing better national social protection floors. It is time to agree on a common roadmap and to increase coordination at all levels to make our common endeavor, social protection floor for all, which is also mentioned in the Agenda 2030, a reality by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valerie. And thank you for the focus on basically social protection and giving us examples from on the ground with the idea that emergency responses that have taken place to expand social protection in time of COVID can perhaps hopefully find a way to sustain. Just to note, as I was hearing you speak around informal workers, coming from Egypt, where a large part of the economy is actually informal, the challenge is always how do you create sufficient incentives for those people to move from the informal and formal sector, right? So for a lot of those people, being in the informal sector is almost by choice. And that move to address that financing gap is quite challenging. So perhaps we can come to this question later in the panel if we have a chance. And I want to move from you to Ms. Elena and basically move from the perspective of what can, organizations such as the ILO, World Bank, UNDP, governments do to what can civil society do. And Elena, in your position, in your work as civil society, curious to hear your thoughts as to how civil society organizations can really support in improving readiness, resilience, right, in the global response as we see.
Thank you, Noura, and thank you so much to the other panelists for providing so much food for thoughts. I would like to start by saying that at all times, but especially, of course, during a crisis, and I think the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, of course, has provided, a quite unique opportunities, but we must acknowledge that there have been other crises, in particular on the African continent and the region I operate in. So West Africa, we had the Ebola crisis very recently that has affected in quite a similar way. We have seen that trust is really essential for people to believe their governments, authorities, that they are in power and they can take difficult action for citizens to change behaviors. And I think I was recently in a conversation with the current mayor of Freetown, Yvonne Akisaya, and she was saying really that she was involved actually in the Ebola crisis and now in her current function as mayor of Freetown, she was really confronted with the pandemic. She has also seen the trust and the way you engage people in, of course, being and building their resilience is critical. So talking with people rather than at people, and talking under the baobab tree rather than through megaphones. I think the approach and the approach to build that trust is critical. And I think it goes back to the concept of voice that the Professor Guy was referring to. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because this is the container where I think civil society is uniquely positioned to really foster cooperative relationships and really encourage accountability, and ultimately really strengthen this relationship of trust between the citizen and the governments. So I want to talk from my firsthand experience and what we have been doing to really nurture this trust and enabling environment. So back in 2017, we piloted an approach in southern Senegal where we could basically promote a model of civic engagement where empowered community members that were that were going through a process where they could really lead their way or define their own vision of well-being. So human security, if you want to call it in this way, in this context, could really then transform or be engaged citizen and be able really to advocate for needs and allocation of resources, as we said. So having a basic income, but then allocating for allocation of resources where they think the biggest needs are. And I think the major lesson learned that we have learned from this is really that empowering people to advocate for themselves and to be part of solving their own problems really creates indeed resilient societies. And we have seen this consistently through our data and our data collection, and in particular with communities that have gone through the Community Empowerment Program, which is our flagship program that really brings community members through a journey of 3 years where we can see really substantial really improvement over outcomes in education, in health, in governance, in environment. We see how climate change really plays a major role in this time of crisis, and so environment and also economic empowerment. So we really see how this multidimensional definition of human security and well-being becomes very relevant when we have resilient communities that are able really to adapt fast and really adapt their behaviors, change their social norms according to the new situation. Now, I think the challenge that we have as civil society organization, but I think this is common to civil society, but also to governments and all the other stakeholders that are in the panel today, on the panel today, so multilateral, bilateral, is really how to scale up and multiply really the impact of many and different worthy efforts to have impact at local, I will start from the local, the national, regional, and of course, global level. And to me, I really want to make the point and the importance to us that we have seen to make this local connection, yeah? The local empowerment, the local voices that are, and the local outcomes when people are given the means to really fulfill their ambitions, that are translated into national outcomes and then global ones. And I think the journey of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a very important one. It's one that we are looking at with a lot of enthusiasm, but also apprehension, because 2030 is just around the corner. And we know that some of the outcomes, in particular around social inclusion, are really lagging behind. And we just need to accelerate, or rather do things differently. And so to conclude, I really would like to advocate for actions that would amplify really the civil society, that could really amplify, that include, civil society initiatives. So the first one is really, I would like to advocate for a commitment by the G20 that really civil society can have a seat at the table in crisis planning and response, because again, they are uniquely positioned to foster really collaboration and really strengthen that trust relationship and advocate for accountability. I would also advocate for more robust commitment really by the G20 generally for accountability and transparency in government finance. And I think we talked a lot about financing social protection, but I think especially for health and education. We need to see advancement in these two areas. So we need to have allocation of resources, but then accountability about that allocation. And then a last message to my colleagues, my C20 colleagues that are sitting at the table and all the ones who are participating in the forum. I think it's important that we see that it's time for collaborative efforts. I don't think we are going to get to the Sustainable Development Goals if we continue with our own agenda. We don't have any agenda. We should be there to supplement communities' agendas, governments' agendas. And I think we really need to invest our resources now in thinking more creatively together to really amplify our efforts in more than a collective way. And so recently, Torsten was a founding member of Catalyst 2030. I really encourage all of you that are listening to me now to look it up. It's an effort, really a collaborative movement to really accelerate the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. It's a member of System Thinker that have been recognized for this work that is really very ambitious and is looking forward to new ways of doing and thinking about really the solution that we need for our challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you for closing with some very clear recommendations to the C20 and to the G20. And I'd like to move to Adam, and with a similar questions as you've heard Elena and as we've heard the other speakers around civil society, and curious particularly as you also sit in UNDP, and so you see the UNDP perspective and you see civil societies. How can really civil societies support governments, support multilaterals to basically meet their commitments? And would be great to also hear your reflections, just as I reflect on the point Elena said around trust. If you can also sort of speak to how can civil society, establish and perhaps increase that trust themselves with government, so between civil society and governments and multilaterals.
Very good. Thank you again, Nora. This is a wonderful panel. So many things are going through my mind now, and I really thank my colleagues for providing this stimulation. I'm reminded of and I'm paraphrasing, I won't get it right, but I'm reminded of a statement by former Secretary General Kofi Annan, where he said that civil society is where sustainable development happens. It's not just talked about, but it's actually done. And to this issue of voice and Professor Guy Standing's comment that this is an uncertain time, it's tougher, it's more complex now than it might have been 50 years ago. I think that part of that is because of the success of CSOs, right? The giving the voice to communities. How else would we know about, I don't know, pick any topic, indigenous population in the Amazon and the impact of deforestation there, if it weren't for a local CSO in Brazil that's communicating those concerns. So in a lot of ways, we should be proud, as a CSO community, that we are there to raise those voices. Now, a couple of thoughts on this issue of kind of our engagement with government and how to be advocates, and the issue of trust. There are a number of drivers of insecurity, and I'll just kind of point to a few. Economic insecurity and how they're interlinked. So in economic insecurity, undermining health, or climate change can undermine economic insecurity. And there are a number of drivers to human insecurity that I think we should keep in mind. Poverty and inequality. And as Connie said in her pre-recorded statement, we're not on track to meet the 2030 goals as now. COVID is then an important catalyst in the wrong direction. So we need to kind of see how it is that we can be more engaged. Climate change is an important driver, threatening human security through undermining livelihoods, compromising culture and identity, increasing population displacement, and we have to think very seriously about displacement, or this curious kind of issue of inability to move now because of COVID. So in the country that I'm in now, Saudi Arabia, 1/3 of the population are expat workers, enormous issues of remittances that are now being decreased because people can't move and can't go back to at least kind of maintain those connections with their families and their, so all of these issues around this pandemic and around the movement of people. Like, I think we're not kind of understanding all the complexities of that and the insecurity that causes. Food insecurity, again, in all countries, we're seeing issues of food transport, inability to get in certain food items. Even in a wealthy country like Saudi Arabia, the Saudi food baskets have been provided to a number of people here in the kingdom, which you may not think would possibly be the case, but it's actually happened. And again, through CSO engagement and others to kind of make that issue a reality. As we kind of look at food insecurity, maybe it's crucial to invest and build resilient rural livelihoods, agricultural systems that promote sustainable use and management of natural resources. Here again, we have kind of everything done in kind of a splintered fashion. Elena had talked about this, that things are not really terribly coherent. And you see successes in one part of a country or even one part of the world that are not then shared with others. So we need to use these kind of forums to be much more systematic in how we share information. And then this, context of sudden onset or protracted crises in post-conflict settings. So in this region, where the United Nations is actively involved in so many different conflicts, and how that is the underlying cause to so many other issues of natural resource mismanagement, water mismanagement, and those other things are causing, increased levels of insecurity. On top of that, put in COVID, and then you have a real kind of humanitarian perfect storm. Weak governance, this is something that I think that the CSOs are well aware of and trying to make clear is that the weak governance is undermining human security concerns, rule of law, accountability, transparent public institutions, and all of those things. So, addressing this kind of human insecurity, I see as, one of the roles of civil society and how they can then link to government is, working with governments to effectively address the development needs. And some of that is that voice issue, how to share knowledge, capacities, resources, and skills. And one of the big challenges of meeting the development agenda, the 2030 agenda, and this was mentioned by one of the speakers, I think it was Valerie, was that just the sheer volume of dollars that are required to meet this need. And the Crown Prince himself here in the kingdom had said that the biggest challenge to meeting the sustainable development goals is the financing gap. It's not a technical issue. It's not like we don't know what works in environmental protection. It's more about finding the resources to actually drive that. And this, I think, is where the CSOs play an important role. And it's an easy way to, your second question there, Nora, on trust. It's an easy way for CSOs to gain trust, is to identify themselves and to recognize that they are a labor force to be reckoned with. In some countries, the CSOs, the community engaging actors, are an enormous resource that the government can use to drive its development agenda. It's no longer this top-down thing waiting for the government to come up with an idea and coming up with a plan and putting it into community X to improve education, but it's the CSOs that are this enormous population that's there and ready to work. And so the trust, I think, comes from showing delivery, to demonstrate that because the CSO is involved in this particular issue related to, girls' education in rural communities, they've done the following, and that can be better replicated and shared. So there's easy wins in some ways. So there's a lot on the voice that we've already talked about, raising awareness, educating public on human security issues, because I think in a lot of cases they're not fully comprehended. And some of the issues that we've talked about in closing the digital divide and having all of the kind of technical infrastructure available to allow people to have that voice, to be able to then track it, to be held accountable for what governments are doing, and to be able to then show other communities what's worked and what hasn't worked. There are, of course, some kind of constraining factors that CSOs face, and a lack of an enabling environment, probably the primary one. And since we're here as part of the broader G20 exercise, this is a statement to make to the G20 leaders. There should be no restrictions on the ability for CSOs to form, to communicate, and to be engaged in their countries. And sometimes there are just lots of different regulations, and of course, frameworks and regulations are required, but the effort should be to be as open and inclusive as possible rather than restrictive. Second kind of issue is the weak institutional capacity, and that's sometimes within CSOs. What are the CSOs themselves trying to do to improve their own capacities? And then the kind of limited partnerships to address human security. Try to be very broad in how CSOs might be engaged. And my experience now, 25 years in the UN, you sometimes have just unnecessary lines drawn in the sand where this community won't work with this one, and because this one is maybe coming from a more strictly security, law enforcement, rule of law sector, this CSO is unable to engage with them. I've just always been a believer in inclusiveness. Better to be in the room and talking widely with a diverse population than to just kind of point fingers through some kind of opaque glass. And that helps on issues of scale up, which are also talked about. And then just in closing, I attended all these different engagement groups are kind of coming, fast and furious. And I was in one session yesterday of the C20, the think tank group, and there was a statement made by Giampiero Massolo. And he had said that, we need to think of, rather than multilateralism, but multi-stakeholderism. And that's really the only way to achieve the development agenda. And here again is where ministries of finance, I think, will recognize the value of CSOs, the resources that can be brought to bear on the development challenges, and not be so caught up in the perfect construct of the UN in this environment or the perfect construct of the G20, but really all of the actors that are driving this agenda. So I'll stop there, Nora. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adam. And thank you. And I think, the first three panelists allowed us to look at both social protection and then zoom into the role of CSOs. And so for the next two panelists, I'd like to focus on two very important topics as we think about human security. And one is education, which we'll cover with Wolfgang, and one is gender, which we'll cover with Corto, and then close with Professor Guy around basic income security. And so, Wolfgang, I'm curious to hear, as we're talking about financing gaps, as we're seeing that state incomes are, are being reduced actually, and expenditures increase during this time of crisis, how can national education budgets basically be protected, knowing that a lot of them anyway should have been increased even prior to COVID?
Okay, thank you, Nora, for that question, and also to the other panelists for the backgrounds that you gave to the issue of security. The answer to the question of how can national education budgets be safeguarded for an economist would be very easy. One could say increase state revenues, reduce wasteful expenditure, cancel debt, and curb corruption, rebalance expenditure portfolios, and put an emphasis on protecting and increasing investment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals with fair and green recovery features, and ring-fence public social services. That sounds easy, but is of course the big task to how do we make this a reality. The global campaign has been advocating and campaigning for increased investment in education in order to achieve the SDG 4 goals, to leave no one behind. And the bigger part of this investment must be funded from domestic sources. We are supporting all our members across the world as a global movement to make sure that this type of advocacy is being carried out in their respective context, because not in every country are we able to sort of speak to the ministries or really engage openly, and as the political space is also shrinking. We believe, however, that the Sustainable Development Goals are achievable and that the barriers to achieving free, quality, public education for all can be eliminated if governments and the international community have sufficient political will to prioritize and invest in education. This requires governments to be more effective, accountable, and responsive in providing citizens their basic human rights in education. Now, I think what the question would then be, what can be done? How do we protect education budgets? Is there really a way that one can sort of campaign for? Or I think we need a kind of a cocktail of multilateral measures directly supporting fiscal recovery of governments, avoiding further debt burden on lower income countries and lower middle income countries. We need to couple those multilateral measures with an increasing support for particular institutions that are sort of specializing on education support, like the Global Partnership for Education and Education Cannot Wait, and their respective replenishment campaigns that are forthcoming. We also need to campaign for kind of an idea of creating grant conditionalities that would link grant approval to lower income countries or partners of the GPE, for instance, to make steps towards a tax reforms or financing architecture reform that encourages then better tax policies, avoiding tax havens, curbing profit migration, And that again is context dependent, because in the case of the education cannot wait grants, I think we have to have another approach there. We need to support countries working towards a 20% tax to GDP ratio. I think the IMF estimates most countries could raise tax to GDP by 5%, would allow them to double up on public service expenditures, including education. The overall budgets could be increased through progressive taxation. I'm not talking about VAT or retrogressive taxation. Spending at least 20% share of the budget on education and 6% or 6% of GDP, and stopping illicit flows and outflows of capital. That requires, of course, a much larger sort of international response. Possibly a review of the debt service suspension initiative by prolonging the suspense, include also private creditors in that scheme. And we will campaign for, together with Jubilee debt campaign, for debt cancellation or an orderly debt restructuring program by using possibly the example of the heavily indebted poor countries example or initiative of 1996, and link, okay. Now the problem is that we have now seen the rhetorics are all there. We heard Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva to sort of have all the right narratives about what needs to happen. But when one looks at the packages that the IMF has put together of recently, and I'm quoting here from a October 2020 report of Eurodad, then we are kind of shocked or astounded by what is forthcoming, because what we see there is that the relief packages, so-called relief packages of the IMF in 80 countries that the or Eurodad analysis has looked into, 40 of these countries will have to cut public budgets to afford a response to the pandemic, as no grant financing and upfront debt relief is provided. 59 countries have fiscal consolidation plans over the next 3 years that are larger than the COVID-19 response packages implemented in 2020. The fiscal consolidation represents 4.8 times the amount of resources allocated to COVID-19 packages in 2020. The burden of those relief packages is also placed more on those most vulnerable, including through indirect taxation measures. For a group of 59 countries for which the data are available, 39 are set to increase the share of indirect taxes in total government revenues. The reduction of public, yes.
Sorry,
hello.
if I can just ask you to start wrapping up, I'm just in the interest of time.
Okay, I think the last aspect is that it looks like the relief packages will lead to heavier debt burdens and vulnerabilities. So I think for us, this is the wrong direction. And as Global Campaign, we are going to campaign very consistently with our other partners, including ActionAid and 190 other organizations that have come out with a call for action that governments need to assume their role as the guarantors of inclusive, equitable, quality education. And we will campaign for a policy change which also sort of makes people aware of what those relief packages do contain and why they are problematic, highly problematic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wolfgang. And I'll move on to Corto. And, you know, as you also discussed, I think we've seen with COVID a rise in gender-based violence. We've seen female employment take a step back. And as you said, you know, perhaps the plan should be feminist moving forward to address the repercussions. Would love to hear your thoughts on how gender can remain a priority and how can we move forward with gender at the center of the agenda for governments and multilaterals.
Thank you, Noura, and thank you, Wolfgang. That was quite, you know, similar to some of the things I'm going to say, and I'm happy that you mentioned ActionAid in the end because, yeah, it's the same sort of wavelength. So the evidence is clear that women will be hardest hit by political, social, and economic disruptions, and also the new normal of climate and humanitarian crisis. I mentioned earlier that this is reinforced by COVID-19. And one thing that is, you know, most affected is the crisis on public services delivery by states. Women, yes, but it also includes LGBTIQ people, migrants, people who are structurally excluded due to their race, ethnicity, class, age, disability, and many other factors. So what we have seen as ActionAid is first that global lockdowns and public health responses, national public health responses, so coronavirus restrictions have unleashed like a shocking surge in gender-based violence. Most of the services associated with any gender-based violence, so whether it's women's shelters, other services related to medical, legal, so the access to justice referral pathway, they are essentially shut down. And it has become difficult for countries because most of them are diverting funding to fight the pandemic. So that's the context across many of the countries where we work. Actually works in about 43 countries around the world. Some examples I'll give you is first in Bangladesh, we have a network. We work with a network of support services, which includes the Rohingya refugee camps. And we found a 10-fold increase in sexual and domestic violence between April to May compared to the same period last year. So that's 983% increase compared to what was happening last year. In Brazil, we've seen the increase in femicide. So 143 women were killed across 12 states in March and April of this year. And there has been a nationwide increase of 22% compared to last year. In Uganda, it's a similar case where they had to shut down like 10 of their shelters due to lockdown restrictions. And case loads have doubled between the same period of March and April of this year. In the Gaza Strip, ActionAid partners also report 700% more survivors of GBV through its counseling services in April to May of 2019. In Italy, a review of more than 228 shelters saw the number of women who asked for support through the government anti-violence hotline increased by 59%. It's a similar case with women's shelters in Nigeria, where they've increased 700% increase in the cases of violence since the lockdown. So that is just to give you a picture across different continents on what is happening. The research that we've done definitely shows that children are also affected, that as children in the global north return to schools, teachers across Africa, Asia, Latin America, they're reporting that many of the girls remain in school because of either early marriage, pregnancy, unpaid care work, which has increased during the pandemic and the lockdown. So ActionAid is calling for public services related to GBV, like women's shelters and referral pathways, to be classified as essential in all emergencies, and for funding to be channeled to local and national organizations who are the frontliners. They are the ones who are responding to the crisis, particularly women-led and women's rights organizations, to be able to receive funding and do the work that they have been doing, even in the absence of resources. There are two things that we have done as ActionAid. So first, 4 years ago, and that was as a result of the work we did on the Ebola crisis in several of the countries where we work, at the inaugural World Humanitarian Summit, there was a promise that 25% of humanitarian funding will go directly to local organizations. And that is something that we'll stay tracking, because we realize that with COVID, there's still, it still remains off track. It is not, up to the level where it is acceptable and effective to support the crisis that ordinary people face. We also appreciate the fact, and I think it's something that civil society has been fighting for, that there was a huge funding gap for GBV services in the UN Global Humanitarian Response Plan. Now we know that 58% of the funding needed to protect women has been committed, and I think that is a positive direction. We know that all of these issues and the provision of public services are linked to debt and tax. And I think several persons have mentioned other broader questions and issues around the macroeconomic policies of the different countries where we work. So I'll bring up the issue of debt, because I think Wolfgang started that discussion. I think Adam also talked about it. We know that we need to link this because countries need the resources to fund their recoveries. As we reevaluate human security and talk about it within the context of a green, just, and feminist recovery, we know that there is a need to have a conversation around debt servicing and financing of development. So we know that countries are due to pay back almost 1 trillion in debt servicing in 2020 and 2021. That is the reality. We also know that the G20 meeting of finance ministers will be happening next week. And there's a leader summit, I think, that happens in November. So ActionAid is calling for the full cancellation of all debt by all low-income countries, at least until 2022. We're also calling for the cancellation of middle-income countries' debt until the end of 2025, with no accumulation of interest changes or hidden costs. We call for an immediate large-scale issue of special drawing rights, so the SDRs, valued at some 3 trillion to provide countries flexible liquidity to deal with the health and economic crisis sparked by the pandemic. We're also calling to an overall end to the austerity measures and public sector wage bill constraints attached to IMF loans, including the emergency loans that have been issued during the COVID crisis. The reason we're doing this is because we know that, like during Ebola, when I was the head of ActionAid Liberia, I was the country director for ActionAid Liberia during the Ebola crisis, and I led ActionAid's response during that time. And the lesson that we've learned from that, and even with the current pandemic, is that civil society has shown that they can come together and build resilience of communities to be able to respond to multiple and complex crises. So whether it's hunger, climate, pandemic, civil society has been able to step up, especially with women, leading the process and being in the front lines.
Corto, I'm sorry, I can just ask you to please wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So it has also put, we know that the crisis has also put pressure on the already fragile health and social care systems, showing that there is an urgent need to invest in public services. So based on that, we're saying that what is essential within this conversation of human security is that we focus on debt cancellation within the period of the pandemic and work out ways that countries will be able, governments will be able to provide public services that will support civil society and support different communities within their countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corto. Sorry that I had to cut you off. And last but definitely not least, Professor Guy, I leave the floor to you as sort of the last word, if you'd like to reflect on what some of the panelists have said. But my directed question relates to the point you started with, which is basic income security and how it can be achieved at this time of crisis and safeguarded as well. To you, please.
Well, yes, and I'm going to have to be very brief. And I'm dealing with these subjects in my recent books. So people, if they're interested, can get further information from those books. I think we've got to put the whole subject into the context of a world economy which has been incredibly fragile. It's a system of rentier capitalism that has been developing over the last 30 years. And that rentier capitalism has meant that more and more of the income being generated has gone to the owners of property, financial property, physical property, and intellectual property. And as that's happened, less and less income has been available for people who rely on labor and work for their income. And that is a global phenomenon. And this incredible fragility is very instructive in what we're going to be seeing out of the pandemic. Because if you compare what's happening in the world economy now with what happened 100 years ago when the Spanish flu pandemic killed more people, it killed probably 50 million people globally, but it was not followed by a global economic slump. But we are going to be experiencing a global economic slump. And the irony of this is that the private property rights have been extended and we've created a new global class structure. One of the worst phenomena that's happened this year is that while the incomes and living standards of billions of people probably have deteriorated, the billionaires of the world, the plutocrats, have seen their wealth multiply. They've seen wealth go up by a quarter. This is a disgraceful aspect of the global system, and it's the elephant in the room. And I've depicted the contrast between when Beveridge designed the social security systems that have been disseminated around the world since the Second World War. He said it was a time for revolutions, not patching. And today we are in a similar position. We cannot just patch up the old system. And he said we were confronted by 5 giants and we have to deal with those 5 giants. And I've said that we have 8 modern giants that are actually intensifying the crisis that we're facing. And it's been building up long before the pandemic hit. I disagree with those who say that everything was doing very well and then the pandemic came along. That is just not the case. We had a situation where inequality, the first giant, has grown to more than at any time in human history. And it's mainly about wealth inequality. And unless you have a strategy for reducing inequalities, structural income and economic inequalities, you don't have a strategy. And that, I think, is the first lesson. A basic income could be an anchor. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems of the giants I'm mentioning, but we need an anchor to give people basic security. And our pilots around the world have shown that if you give people basic income and give it to all in a community, then they will become more resilient, which is a fundamental lesson that we're learning this year. Unless your weakest members of society are resilient, we're all non-resilient. And I think that the essence of dealing with the first giant, inequality, goes with how we deal with the second. The second giant is insecurity. In discussing that and how it uncertainty and all those problems. And the third, related to it, being very quick, is stress. We have incredible stress around the world. Millions and millions of people are chronically anxious all the time. And with respect to Valerie, many countries have spent millions and millions on social security systems, and yet insecurity has increased. In India, where I've been working, they literally have thousands of social security schemes. Insecurity and inequality and deaths of despair have been going up. It's not the amount that you spend, it's the way you say, how are we going to reduce people's sense of insecurity and their sense of stress? And of course, we've mentioned debt, but one of the big differences between the Spanish flu period and today is that at that time, private debt was very small around the world, less than 50% of GDP in rich countries. But at the beginning of the pandemic, private debt was over 150% of GDP, even in the rich countries. So you only have to have a slight downturn and millions of people can't service their debts. And they're going to be pushed into homelessness and food banks and all of that that goes with it, and the deaths of despair. And that leads to the fifth giant, the giant of precarity. We haven't had it mentioned in this discussion, but we have a system of precarity where huge numbers of our so-called citizens are losing the rights of citizenship. That's a form of insecurity. They're losing the right to the commons. They're losing civil rights. They're losing social rights. They're losing cultural rights. And that is existential insecurity, which is being created by the economic system. And that, I think, is fundamentally important. The sixth giant that we haven't mentioned, but automation and technological change is proposing a lot of threats to people, disrupting lives. It's not ending jobs or ending work forever, but it's being increasingly disruptive and increasingly insecure as a result. And then we come to the seventh giant, which is the biggest of all, and that is the threat of extinction. If there's one other lesson we've learned from this pandemic, is if we treat nature as merely resources to be used and depleted and to increase our growth, there will be payback. This is already the sixth pandemic of this century. That's unprecedented. And the reason is if we insult nature, it will spread viruses. It will lead to pandemics of different types. And we've got to deal with that threat of extinction. And that means we've got to have eco-taxes. We've got to have taxes on bads. But we can only have that if we recycle the revenue gained to give people a sense of basic security. Otherwise, they won't put up with it. They can't. There will be riots. But we need those eco-taxes. And that leads to the eighth giant, which we haven't mentioned, but I'm sorry to be a bore, but it's the threat of neo-fascist populism. Today, we are faced with a political threat of authoritarianism and the chipping away of our basic freedoms, our basic humanity. Anybody who doubts me should listen to a few of the speeches given by Trump in the last few months. We can't pretend this isn't happening. We can't have a debate about how to revive security without realizing that this is a real threat to us today. And unless we address the causes of people supporting people like him, which includes Wolfgang's discussion about education, we need a different type of education. It's not just merely a matter of spending more. We've got to reorient our education for the values of citizenship, not just for the economy. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is we have a systemic crisis. And to address the low-hanging fruit subjects, I think is doing a disservice to our debate. I'm not saying that's been the case today. I think there have been extremely interesting things, but I do urge all of us to realize that if you give everybody basic income security, they make better citizens, more resilient, and they become better people. And that is why please look at the pilots that we've been doing, because to see the results at the local level of villages and townships just makes you cry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Guy, and thank you very much for your profound statements. And I'm not even going to try to summarize in 30 seconds a very, very rich discussion, but I think it leaves a lot of thoughts on social protection, basic income security, financing. I think we're all in agreement of the need. Perhaps the question to states is the financing and the prioritization as different things take other priorities on the agendas of governments and multilaterals. And it's been a true honor and a true privilege to have been with you all today. I learned a lot from the panel myself. I thank you so much for your time. I apologize to the participants that we were not able to take questions, but I'm sure that this rich discussion has left you with a lot of thoughts, a lot of learnings, and a lot of other questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of the panelists, for your time and your expertise.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.